Today I thought I'd talk about what is it like living in New Zealand. I'm aware that there has been a lot of interest on the New Zealand immigration website, and I have lived in the United Kingdom and Australia in the past, so I'm kind of aware of the differences between those two countries. So let's get straight into it. I'm not going to talk about visas or any of that stuff because, to be honest, I don't really know. It's best to check out your own country's information. And things are changing right now, so anything I say now might be wrong in a couple of weeks. One tip: when you first arrive, be careful with dirt and fruit. We do have sniffer dogs checking you're not bringing fruit into the country, and other types of food like honey. We're just very careful of our environment. Weather and geography. There are 4.8 million people living in New Zealand and 3.6 million living in the North Island. So North Island's warmer than the South Island. In winter there's lots of different patches of snow in the South Island and snow generally just around Ruapehu on the North Island. So there's two islands. You can take a ferry between the two and it takes around 3 to 3.5 hours. You can go as a foot passenger on a public bus, or you can take your car or caravan, and the two companies are Inter-Islander and Blue Bridge. Our landmass, we're actually a little bit larger than the UK, which is surprising. So we've got a lot smaller population and a slightly larger landmass. Our oceans are colder. We really do sometimes feel like the end of the world, and Australia is our closest neighbour, and that's quite a distance away. So I have heard people visiting do mention that New Zealand, swimming in the ocean is cold here. We have rougher surf on the west and slightly calmer on the east coast. And then if you keep going south, you hit Antarctica. If the wind's coming from the south, then it's going to be cold. If you want a cheap holiday overseas, people tend to go to the Gold Coast in Australia or the Pacific Islands like Fiji. They're probably the cheapest flights, but if you want a cheap holiday, you could spend a bit more flying to Asia and then stay there longer and for cheaper. But our flights really are a lot more expensive than what you would pay for, say, going around Europe. A lot more expensive. We have areas of thick, wet forest, which we call bush. This really used to cover huge areas of New Zealand, but it's slowly been converted into farmland. I kind of think of New Zealand as quite rugged and still has that wild feel in a lot of areas. And a random fact, New Zealand broke away from the main land mass a lot earlier than some other countries, so our only mammal is a bat. We have a whole lot of birds and insects. We do have a couple of poisonous spiders, but to be honest, I've never had a friend get bitten, never heard of anyone personally getting bitten. I think the biggest concern for people are getting lost in the bush or swimming in the ocean and getting swept out by a rip. Our indigenous people are Maori, so we have a lot of place names in the Maori language. The Maori name for New Zealand is Aotearoa, which means land of the long white cloud. Captain Cook arrived in 1769. We have a lot of farms. There used to be a lot of sheep, but now it's become more dairy. But we still have 6 sheep to every 1 person, so it's still a lot. Our summers are December to February, our winters are June to August. And then lifestyle. We are pretty relaxed here. We don't really like to kick up a fuss, and our dress code is pretty casual unless you're kind of working in the corporate world or maybe in a big city centre. But if you go to the smaller towns, you can kind of get away with wearing gumboots and dirty jeans to the supermarket, or even bare feet. It doesn't really matter. We do seem to be sports mad. It used to be dominated by rugby, but other sports have leaked in. And some Kiwis do make the most of our outdoors. We've got plenty of options with hiking or kayaking, or a lot of people seem to have a boat or caravanning and motorhoming or hunting, you know, the list goes on. There's plenty of outdoor options. And I have noticed we don't seem to be as dog friendly as, say, in the UK. Some towns ban dogs from the city centre and it just can get a bit tricky. Not all campgrounds welcome dogs as well. We have 10 public holidays. That's like a bank holiday in the UK, and they tend to be all clumped around our summer. Our shopping malls close pretty early. They're only open late generally on Thursdays and Fridays. Bars are generally only busy on Fridays and Saturdays, and if you go to the smaller towns there might only be a club and that's about it. And people tend to prefer barbecues at home a lot of the time. It definitely is different to the UK. Different. But we do have plenty of cafes and bakeries with good coffee, good meat pies and good fish and chips. No tipping is required, but you can if you want to. So Auckland, public transport is painful. You know, Auckland's kind of squeezed in the middle. There's a thin landmass and we were a bit slow on the uptake and organising public transport. So generally you have to handle a bus, certain parts have a train, but I don't particularly like the public transport in Auckland. So a lot of people drive. And you can take buses from city to city. We don't really take the train. And generally it is just hunters who have guns, and also we do have some mobs in New Zealand with illegal firearms, but to be honest they tend to stick to themselves and they don't really bother the general public. I feel safe in New Zealand, and I do feel like it is a safe place to raise kids. Work, if you are in the corporate world, you will probably end up in Auckland, Wellington or Christchurch. Our biggest industries are agricultural, construction and tourism, although tourism has taken a knock right now. If you want to find work, I would recommend looking on Seek, TradeMe or LinkedIn. And then there will be specialised areas, like I'm a graphic designer, so I have in the past looked on something called Stop Press. If you work in New Zealand, you need a tax number, which is called an IRD number. And we are entitled to 4 weeks of paid leave every year, which I know is more generous than other countries. And then housing. I find flats or houses through TradeMe, or if you're looking for a house, you can also use realestate.co.nz. Renting is very hard in Wellington, and to be honest, pretty hard in most of the bigger cities. You need a bond, a reference, and you're usually in a 1-year contract. If you want to buy, it's very expensive in Auckland, Wellington, Queenstown and Wanaka. If buying, be aware, our older wooden houses are pretty cold. They're, you know, single pane wooden framed windows, and they didn't really have insulation, although now the government is helping to subsidise adding insulation to all houses. And then beware if you're going for a newer one from say 1980s to 2000s, mid-2000s, we did have a leaky house problem, so you will need to get the house really checked over. Kiwis generally expect to buy a standalone house with a nice backyard, with a bit of grass, you know, space for that barbecue. Terrace houses and apartments are starting to become more acceptable in the bigger cities where, you know, we're just getting housing problems. There's not enough houses for everyone really. And health. Most ambulances are free in the odd place, like I think Wellington. Otherwise it's about $98 call out. You can get insurance. I think I heard it was like $60 a year to have insurance, but you don't really need to. Visitors might need to pay more, so that would be worth checking. And you don't really need health insurance. Most hospitals will treat you for free. I think there's something like nobody can be refused emergency care if they are unable to pay. But if you're not a New Zealand resident, you may have to pay for some services, something to be aware. There can be a wait for surgery, so that's the real advantage to having health insurance. It just speeds things up a little bit. And then an example, if I needed to go to the doctor or GP, I'll use my own doctor as an example. Took a while to find one, I keep moving around too much. So if I'm a registered patient, it costs between $19 to $36 a visit. But if I'm not registered, it costs between $51 to $71. And then most accidents are covered by ACC as well. And children get basic teeth care up to age 18. And we tend to get fluoride added to our water in most towns. Not all, but most. And also, dentists in New Zealand are pretty good, but they can be on the pricier side. And cars. We drive on the left side of the road. We tend to get a lot of second-hand imports from places like Japan, and generally are more Asian cars. We do have some European cars, but the downside is the parts tend to cost more just to get them into New Zealand. And then automatic cars are becoming more popular as well. If you have a newer car, you get a warrant of fitness and register your car once a year. If you have an older car, it's every 6 months. And that just does a general check to make sure it's roadworthy. They also check for rust, which does tend to be an issue in New Zealand. And you don't need to get another check done before you sell. If you're buying a car in New Zealand, it is best to pay for yourself to get a pre-purchase inspection. Insurance isn't compulsory, but highly recommend getting a third-party insurance, which is at least cheaper. And if I was buying a vehicle, I would probably look on Trade Me. And government. I'm going to actually read this out from Wikipedia just to get it right. The structure of government is based on the Westminster system, and the legal system is modelled on the common law of England. So we are a Commonwealth country, and so we do have a strong influence from the United Kingdom. Now I'm going to give a really basic overview of the parties in government. You can tell me I'm wrong. So basically there's National and Labour. They are the two main parties. And just an overview of what they're about. Labour, I would say, is about community. National, I would say, is about business. Then you've got a smaller party called Green, which is based on the environment. New Zealand First, which is based more on national. And then you've got ACT, which seems to be more right-wing. And to be honest, our politics seem pretty tame compared to overseas politics, which I'm happy with. I'm happy with that. Banking, it's just a little bit different. Some of the phrases we use, which I noticed in the UK, instead of saying cash back, we say cash out. Instead of saying debit card, we say FPOS. And right now, you can pay wave for quite a large amount just because of COVID. Most of our banks are really Australian owned. I think it's just Kiwi Bank, which is connected to the post shop that's New Zealand owned. And I found out when I was moving overseas that my bank ASB actually has relationships with overseas banks. So I could start opening a bank in the UK from New Zealand, which was HSBC Bank, and through to Australia, which is the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, which makes it a little bit easier. So it's worth going to your bank just to see what relationships they have. And then schools. So there's public schools, or I think they're called state schools as well, or private schools, which cost quite a lot of money. I went to a good public school, and yeah, I was happy with my education overall. The main school holidays are over Christmas during the summer months. Kids start school at 5, then they're there for about 13 years, and it's broken up into primary school, intermediate, and high school. And kids attending public or state schools are generally expected to go to their nearest school that they live to. And just being aware that the government has a decile rating for each school with how much the government will contribute, and it really does depend on how much money the surrounding neighborhood earns to how much is needed to help out, like, you know, giving lunches into the poorer areas. And then universities, generally a bachelor degree would take 3 years, and then you can carry on to masters, etc., or you can just carry on, you know, just start working. Price wise, the government does help out some, but it still adds up, so a lot of people do end up with debt, university debt. But I have heard it's not quite as extreme as, say, compared to America. And then generally you pick what area you want to focus on right from the start. So I did a Bachelor of Art and Design focusing on graphic design, and I have found that our university degrees seem to be well received overseas as well. Well, hopefully you found that helpful and useful. Did I miss anything? Feel free to comment below, or if you have any other questions. I honestly don't really know about the visa side of things, but I can answer any questions about what living in New Zealand is like.